In La Notte, architecture is protagonist in many different ways. As soon as the film starts with the credits, we are already seeing an architecture statement. We are atop a skyscraper. It's the only skyscraper in Milan, and it was newly built in 1958 by the architect Gio Ponti. We get a view of the city from above, an impossible really view before skyscrapers really existed in Milan, which is a flat city. We scroll down the facade of the building and we see the window frames. And therefore, we become aware of one of the most important links between architecture and cinema, the frame. The frame is redoubled as we scroll down the facade of the building, and it's almost as if we feel the materiality of film. It makes the building into a kind of celluloid band. But it does something also more interesting than that, because we see the city reflected in the windows. So this facade becomes animated by shadows, by reflections, by light. It's a facade that speaks in a very interesting fashion of the possibilities of modern architecture to have, with the glass building, a series of reflections. And it makes us reflect on the fact that the film screen is, in fact, a frame of light, a luminous surface that comes alive with shadows and lights and with reflections. So we really become aware of the materiality of filmic architecture as we scroll down the building. We descend onto the streets. And here, too, architecture is protagonist. La Notte is practically a film about modern architecture. There isn't a single building that's not been built after the war. Antonioni takes us on a stroll through modern architecture. He takes us on a walk.
Che bel posto qui, eh? Tutto ciò che odiavo in fatto di arredamento. Non avrei mai immaginato una conclusione così di luce.
What is interesting is that the walk is led by a female character, by Lydia.
Io devo andare.
Her reaction to finding out that her friend is ill is, in fact, to start wandering through the city. And here we get a sense of the way in which Antonioni constructs his plots by taking us on kind of architectural tours, in a way. The plots are tours and detours. They're not following a linear narrative. They're not about causality. It's more that you follow the sense of the idea of what it is to be a modern city dweller, what it is to live in a situation that is about unrest. She doesn't really tell us how upset she is by her friend dying, but she tells us by the way in which she walks through the city, by the way in which she tries to find out something perhaps about herself, about her life, reflecting. And all of these reflections happen on architectural reflections. So this idea of the surface reflecting is very important in the film. In this way, architecture becomes even more of a protagonist. It is not simply that architecture is featured in these films, but it becomes, in fact, the way in which we find out what the characters think, what the characters feel. It's by seeing Lydia pinned up against the gray wall, by watching her wandering, by looking at her being entrapped in frames that are perpendicular, that are barred, that are very often geometries, that we realize what her state of mind really is. There is a kind of flat, abstract style present throughout the film. Everything is white and gray. Everything is framed through very geometric lines, like modern architecture. And the character walks through the streets in this way, showing in many ways her relation to the city, and at the same time, the city reflects on her state of mind. Architecture really becomes a kind of psychogeographic journey, a way in which exterior landscapes become interior landscape, and interior landscapes, vice versa, are displayed on the facades of the building, on the walls of the apartment.
Franca? La signora non è rientrata, vero?
No.
Non ha neanche telefonato, no?
No. Sarebbe pronto.
No, grazie, aspetto. Se lei deve uscire, vada pure.
Grazie.
And Antonioni also uses another interesting architectural technique that makes us sense the space. It's a technique that in Italian is called tempi morti, which in English would translate badly as dead times. But in fact, it means lingering on the times of non-action. It means being in space. It means beginning the frame before the character walks in, or lingering onto the frame after the character has left us. And that lingering onto the frame makes us be in the space of the city. We feel that we're not cutting on action, but we are, in fact, part of the city. We are watching, we participate, we belong to the state of architecture and to the state of mind of the city that Lydia lives in. And in this way, she also makes casual encounters with characters who are not main characters in the films, but they are the characters of the city. They are, in fact, the character of the city. And in this way, we actually become aware of what it is to be in Milan in 1961. She walks the street through posts. Then at some point, the urban post becomes an old woman. Then she's like an object in the city. And that's another commentary, in a way, on perhaps what has happened to the surface of behavior. And this stays with us because by now, of course, this is a document of a particular place at a particular time and also of an atmosphere. This is a way in which, through architecture, Antonioni makes us aware of the fact that architecture is also atmosphere. It's mood. It's sensing what happens in a culture at a certain moment in time. At this particular moment in time, characters suffer from a sort of existential anxiety, a form of malaise that, like Antonioni's walk, doesn't have a real object. That to a certain extent, it really is a sense of internal unrest. And in this sense of unrest, there is also a desperate desire to touch, to be in contact with people. You see it through the walk that Lydia takes through the city, for she stops and looks at people. They return her gaze. She looks up at the buildings. She senses the way in which helicopters and airplanes are coming into this new landscape of the city. And she tries to be there in the space. The most interesting part of this is when she leaves the modern architecture style and enters into a building, an old building that appears to have been bombed by the war, perhaps, and still in the state of ruin. She walks into the courtyard and sees one of Antonioni's classic found objects, a clock that is stopped in the middle of the ruined courtyard. She also sees a child alone, crying, and tries to comfort him. But even that doesn't really quite work. And she looks at the walls and sees these old peeling walls where perhaps the sense of history, the sense of something having been there, been ruined, but also in change, is embedded. And she touches the wall. And that particular gesture is one of the most interesting ways in which architecture puts us in touch, in a way, with history, with also transformation, with changes. And it really signifies this desire that the characters have in Antonioni's film to find a way of being in touch. I think it would be wrong to think that Antonioni speaks of modern architecture as alienation. He's really fascinated by it. He's fascinated by the way in which this new architecture creates a new form of behavior. And he becomes the explorer, the first, I think, and most important explorer of the modern architecture. In this modern world, it has radically changed the surface of behavior, and so a new surface of behavior must be found. So looking at the facades of the cities, at the peeling wall, the texture of the walls, we become aware of the fact that architecture for Antonioni is architecture, that there's a way in which the texture, the fabric of society, the fabric of behavior is shown on the facades, and vice versa. The facades, with their own surfaces, speak of this change in society.
Aspetti qui.
It's interesting to me that it is a woman who takes that particular walk. She's the idler who walks the street, and yet she's not a streetwalker. This is not something that was normal or usual in Italy in 1961 still. For a woman to own the public streets of the city, to be able to be comfortable, looking up at men returning their gaze, standing for her own gaze. And so in many ways, the first positive change of the surface of behavior as we see it on the surface of the architecture is the fact that the modern woman is born in Antonioni's film, and that she, in fact, is a subject of looking, and she's the subject of the possibility of existing in mobility in public space. She even goes off into the periferia, into that landscape that we will also see in Pierpaolo Pasolini's film, on the edges of the city, where we see Milan still being somewhat rural and being transformed into the city of concrete, into the new city. And even in that particular situation, she is aware of her surroundings and holds her gaze and able in many ways to show us this incredible transformation that has happened in society.
Dove sei?
Sono a Sesto San Giovanni, davanti alla Breda. Al solito prato. Ci sono dei ragazzi. Sono sicura che ti piacerà.
It's interesting that Antonioni juxtaposes her long walk with Giovanni being at home. It's a kind of interesting gender reversal. He goes home, waits for her, and she's walking through the streets, in a sense, wondering what's happening to her life, and to her friend, while he stays safely at home. We continue in the style that makes us aware of the possibility of distending time and space, of having a plot that, in fact, does not follow action, but rather rambles through different places, different time, different spaces, and we become aware of emptiness. We become aware of empty spots. The gray, flat, empty walls become also gaps in the narrative, or rather ellipses and eclipses. I think about Antonioni's use of modern architecture, of the gray, flat walls, of the white walls, and also of the glass architecture, is that they appear to be empty, but in fact, in this emptiness, there is a texture, there is, on the surface, there is a kind of complexity that's showing. This is one of the most interesting formal points about the film. Sometimes I think of his films in the way in which he described them himself. Once he was in New York City and went to visit the studio of Mark Rothko and looked around at the studio at these monochromatic, flat painting, which have tremendous texture, and said, "Your paintings are just like my films. They're about nothing with precision." And so as we look at these flat, abstract compositions and the landscape of the film, we realized that there is tremendous substance in this void. And so the surface here has depth. Even their superficial behavior has depth. You know, in many ways, one wonders. A friend is dying, and these people are going to a nightclub or to a party. What are we to make of this? But it's not superficial. In many ways, like Lydia's walk through the city, this wandering through these different spaces of superficial behavior show us that, in fact, something has radically changed in the surface of behavior. And so the human figure against these lines becomes something that's not the Renaissance man in front of the arch of an old building, but the human figure itself becomes understood as a different object or a different subject. And so you realize that there is a kind of interpenetration of the two that is not about harmony, but it's about really understanding that sense of complexity of compositions that compose modern life.
In questo momento non ne ho. Ma ne sto aspettando uno. Lo sento venire.
Antonioni has shot modern architecture in beautiful way throughout the film. We have seen incredibly gorgeous compositions. In fact, very often you could freeze frame on anything in Antonioni and you would have a fantastic photograph that you could put on the wall, a piece of art really on its own. So we've had volumes being shown to us, a sort of sense of volumetric sculpture by the way the lines of these modern buildings have intersected, perpendicular, parallel, angular, and also a sense of scale. We have seen Lydia very tiny against the enormous concrete structure of a new building. We've become aware of volumes in scale and geometry and flatness and abstraction. But what happens towards the end of the film is that he starts almost making a kind of architectural reflection on the reflections that happen on glass. I think one of the ways in which Antonioni makes this the most clear is when we get to the villa in Brianza, where a series of very long articulated encounters at this party take place towards the end of the film.
Lei, Pontano, che cosa farebbe se non scrivesse?
Qualche anno fa si sarebbe ucciso. Adesso non lo so. E tu, Giovanni?
No, non mi sento così importante. Ci sono altre soluzioni.
This is a building like the one that we have seen at the beginning of the film that's mostly built in glass. And Antonioni makes use of this glass in a very interesting way to continue to reflect on this idea of the surface and how the surface contains depth. We are used to think that glass buildings are about visibility, that one of the changes that is made in modern architecture is with the entrance of glass is that walls are no longer walls, that you could see through, that you could see everything. But Antonioni makes that much more complex. In fact, I think he makes one of the most interesting statements about modern architecture by filming in this way the glass buildings. You can never see entirely through these glass architecture. It's almost as if they represent a kind of barrier at the same time as they make visible. And this relation between visibility and opacity is in fact a theme throughout the film. You can no longer have a window onto the soul. The window has changed. This is a different kind of window. And we see this from the very beginning. That is the reason why the scroll down the building built by Joe Ponti is filmed in the way it is filmed. This is a new window. It's a glass window that both obscures and makes complex as well as makes visible.
Mi trova qualcuno che venga a giocare con me?
Io non vado bene.
No, troppo vecchio.
Se gioco con lei certamente ringiovanisco.
Io non voglio ridere.
So you have moments in Antonioni's film when you realize that the way of treating the surface of glass architecture is also treating a fundamental change in Italian society, a change that deeply affects the way in which private life and public life are conceived and the borders between what's private and what's public.
Vorrei avere notizie del signor Garani. Stanza 103. Quando? 10 minuti fa. Sua madre era lì.
What's private becomes public. Privacy becomes publicity. There's a way in which this film shows too much, exposes things that could not be seen before. A couple, married couple having affairs, a kind of unerotic sense that is also connected to boredom. These are all behaviors that are new, that in many ways are new ways of understanding private life and certainly are not about domesticity.
È bello qui, vero?
The other thing is that with modern architecture, when you make something visible that is private, you also make it exposed, and therefore there's no longer that sense of the little protected side of the private life. And there is no domesticity here. Everything, in a sense, is exposed as it is exposed on the glass surface. So we could also talk about voyeurism in some way that happens at points, and exhibitionism. There's ways in which some of the character, also the female character, exhibit themselves as we are peering through this complicated surface structure of the modern architecture. So all of that changes the relation, and it's really by something that's not said, but it is shown in space.
A me piacerebbe un romanzo in cui ci fosse una donna che si innamora di un uomo. Ma quest'uomo non si innamora di lei, no. Lui è preso dalla sua intelligenza, dal suo temperamento. Stanno insieme e poi... E poi come può finire una storia del genere?
Può finire in tanti modi.
Lei dovrebbe essere una donna importante, capace di sacrificarsi. Anzi, ecco il finale. Lei si sacrifica per la felicità di un'altra donna.
Ma perché si sacrifica?
Così. Mi fa venire da piangere.
And by the way in which the space itself is shot, organized, itself exposed, and worked on. So he's not simply just showing these buildings, he's actually making, in a way, the surface of behavior come to life onto the surface itself of modern architecture. Every time you meet the character through these glass walls, there's always something, a reflection in the wall, a complexity in the frame, an awareness of layers that comes by filming those glass walls in a way that they reflect something else in it, and so that they become more than a space of visibility. Sometimes they are a barrier, sometimes they're a way to get something through. So you realize that this difficulty of touching, of communicating, is also being communicated by putting this partition between the characters, a partition which is visible. So it's different than a wall. It's a different kind of partition, a visible partition that's as visible as a screen. After all, the screen is an architecture of partition. When we say screen, the etymology itself of the filmic screen comes from this idea of partition. So in many ways, from the very beginning of the film, as we have scrolled down the building, becoming aware of this luminous surface that has layers of texture that reminds us of the architecture of the screen, we arrive at the end of the film at embodying the sense that we really now understand filmic architecture. And we understand how filmic architecture is very close to modern architecture in that it becomes a different kind of screen, in that it is a surface that screens in and screens out. Cinema is an architectural art form because it is a place of passage. It's a place that makes us aware of thresholds, of entrance and exits. Not only a window, it's a door in many ways. People insist too much on this idea of the window, but here what you realize is that these windows are walls, and these walls are also doors. So in many ways, this modern architecture that he's filming is also making us aware of a different form of architectonics. It's much more filmic.
Mi scusi, non posso.
We arrived towards the end of the film, having really not heard, to a certain extent, in dialogue, what the characters think, but we know everything by now, because we have been able to feel it, to sense it. This desire that they themselves have to be in touch is something that is transferred on to us. And so by interpreting and reading, in many ways, what has been happening on the surface of these walls and these facades, by being able to be in this space, we become aware of what is happening, not only to the characters, but to society at large.
Mi avete ridotto a uno straccio voi due stasera.
What's interesting is that at the end of the film, Antonioni reveals that in a dialogue. But in order to do that, he has to walk outside of the city, outside of the building, and you get into this open space that, in a sense, it opens the character's possibility to speak. But it's not because they're taking refuge in a different space. This is not a place of escape. It's simply another gray, in a sense, texture against which they can reflect, and that it reflects back, in a sense, what we already know. So it becomes another screen in many ways, another place of passage between the interior landscape and the exterior landscape.
Prima ho telefonato in clinica. Tommaso è morto.
Prima quando? Perché non mi hai detto niente?
Stavi giocando giù.
What's very interesting about this last sequence is that, in a way, this is also a constructed landscape. There is no nature here. This is, in fact, almost a kind of landscape painting. And it's shot in such a way that it reveals an atmosphere, just as the modern architecture was an atmosphere.
Se stasera ho voglia di morire, è perché non ti amo più. Sono disperata per questo. Vorrei essere già vecchia per averti dedicato tutta la mia vita. Vorrei non esistere più, perché non posso più amarti. Ecco, questo è il pensiero che mi è venuto mentre eravamo al nightclub e tu ti annoiavi.
This is just as flat, as abstracted, and as textural as the surface of the glass walls we've been looking at. So to me, there's a kind of form of continuation.
Non sono riuscito a darti niente. Non mi sono reso conto di niente. Ho buttato, continuo a buttare la mia vita così come uno stupido, prendendo senza dare, o senza dare abbastanza.
Michelangelo Antonioni somewhat secretly painted while he was making films, and his paintings were not exhibited in art galleries or even known about for quite a long time. And looking at them, as I had the pleasure to do for the first time, I realized that there was something very interesting about the painting that spoke about the filmic landscape that he was constructing, and vice versa. These were landscapes, and landscapes is not something one thinks about when one thinks of Antonioni. One thinks of the city, metropolitan space. So first one could be slightly confused. I mean, what are we doing here in a landscape? But then the more I thought about it, and it was La Notte who particularly makes me think of that, is that in fact Antonioni is treating architecture as a landscape of privacy and publicity. It's a complex landscape in which, on the surface, all of these different behaviors and modes of existence come to life. And so it made sense that he would make landscape paintings.
No. No. No, no. Non ti amo più, non ti amo più. E anche tu non mi ami più.
Sta zitta, sta zitta, sta zitta.
In the end, we leave them there. One of the ways in which Antonioni always leaves things open. There's a sense in which the plot, which is loose in some form, allows tremendous freedom. As you can wander through the city streets, you can also continue to wonder about the state of mind of the characters. So we begin with a movement. We begin with the camera scrolling down the facades of the Pirelli building by Gio Ponte. We end up with another camera movement that again perhaps takes us back into the city. It is in Antonioni that you see how much architecture really determines in many ways the way in which film language is constructed in terms of frames and compositions and movements through space, and which are also movements through time. And at the same time, you realize how much, in a sense, film owes to architecture, because it's not simply a visual art, it's a spatial art. It's something that makes us aware not just of a way of looking, but of a way of being in space or existing in space. And Antonioni is a crucial figure in that. I think that's where, to a certain extent, you realize that the two are connected in very, very deep form. And it's because of the way he shoots. It's not that he's just filming these buildings, he's making them into modern architectures. And Antonioni is the one filmmaker that, to my mind, makes us most aware of it by constructing an architecture of filmic language in his films.